Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Marx Labor Power Working Class by Tronti. Chapter 2 is titled The Exchange of Money for Labor. Let's call labor power L, money M, and the means of production MP. The sum of commodities, capital C, becomes labor power plus means of production. More succinctly, CL, so the sum of commodities, labor power, I don't know. Okay. More succinctly, C, the sum of commodities, being constant, being labor power and means of production. Considered according to its content, money purchasing commodities thus appears as money purchasing the commodities, labor power, and means of production. That is, money's purchasing of commodities subdivides into money purchasing labor power and money purchasing means of production. Quote, the sum of money, M, is separated into two parts, one of which buys labor power, the other the means of production. These two series of purchases belong to entirely different markets, the one to the commodity market proper, the other to the labor market. End quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 2. When money purchasing the means of production is completed, the buyer not only disposes of the means of production plus labor power, he also possesses a greater availability of labor power. That is to say, a quantity of labor bigger than that necessary to substitute for the value of labor power, and simultaneously he disposes of the means of production required for the realization and objectification of this sum of labor. The value anticipated in the form of money is thus now found in a natural form, in which it can be realized as a value that produces surplus value. Money capital has transformed into productive capital. The value of productive capital is equal to the value of labor power and means of production, equal to the money converted into labor power and means of production. Thus, quote, money purchasing labor power is the characteristic movement in the transformation of money capital into productive capital, because the purchasing of labor power is the essential condition for the real transformation of value advanced in the sum of money into capital, into a value that produces surplus value. Money purchasing means of production is necessary only for the purpose of realizing the quantity of labor bought in the process of money purchasing labor power. End quote. Marx. From the capitalist point of view, labor power appears on the market just like any other commodity, possessed by no matter whom. Labor power's sale and purchase, parenthesis, quote, the sale and purchase of human activity, end quote, bracket, Kauf und Verkauf von menschlicher Tätigkeit, and bracket, and parenthesis, represents nothing more out of the ordinary than the sale and purchase of any other commodity. From the worker's point of view, the productive application of the worker's labor power becomes possible only after their labor power is sold. When the worker's labor power is set in mutual connection with the means of production. For each of them, quote, before labor power's sale, labor power exists therefore separately from the means of production, from the material conditions of labor power's application, end quote. Marx. Before labor power's sale, before labor power's sale, which is to say, before the formal act of exchange and outside of circulation, sorry, hold on, I fucked that up. Before its sale, which is to say, before the formal act of exchange and outside of circulation, the elements of production are themselves divided and counterposed, with the objective factors concentrated on one site and working activity, in isolation from these factors on the other. Quote, true. In the act of money capital purchasing labor power, the owner of money and the owner of labor power enter only into the relation of buyer and seller, confront one another only as money owner and commodity owner, ... Yet at the same time, the buyer appears also from the outset in the capacity of an owner of means of production, which are the material conditions for the productive expenditure of labor power by labor power's owner. In other words, these means of production are in opposition to the owner of labor power, being property of another. On the other hand, the seller of labor faces the seller of labor's buyer. On the other hand, the seller of labor faces labor's buyer as labor power of another. Go on. On the other hand, the seller of labor faces its buyer as labor power of another, which must be made to do his bidding and must be integrated into his capital in order that the labor power may really become productive capital. The class relation between capitalist and wage laborer therefore exists, is presupposed from the moment the two face each other in the act of money capital purchasing labor power, or labor power being sold for wages on the part of the laborer. End quote. Marx. It is only when this class relation already exists that circulation is necessarily interrupted. Capital value in the form of productive capital cannot continue to circulate. It must pass into consumption, and more specifically into productive consumption. Quote, the use of labor power, labor, can be materialized only in the labor process. End quote. Marx. The capitalist cannot resell the worker as a commodity, for the worker is not the capitalist's slave. The capitalist has only purchased the use of her labor power for a determinate time. On the other hand, the capitalist can use labor power only by making the worker use the means of production to create commodities. Thus, quote, whereas labor power is a commodity only in the hands of labor power's seller, the wage laborer, labor power becomes capital only in the hands of labor power's buyer, the capitalist who acquires the temporary use of the wage laborer's labor power. The means of production do not become the material forms of productive capital or productive capital until labor power, the personal form of existence, bracket persönliche Daseinsform, Desilben, and bracket, of productive capital, is capable of being embodied in them. Human labor power is by nature no more capital, it says than by means of production. So I think it's an error though. Human labor is by nature no more capital than our means of production. They acquire this specific social character only under definite historically developed conditions, just as only under such conditions the character of money is stamped upon precious metals, or that of money capital upon money. End quote. Marx. It is for this reason that capitalist production concerns capitalist production self, not only with producing commodities in surplus value, but so too with reproducing the class of wage workers in ever greater numbers, transforming the huge majority of direct producers into wage laborers. Money purchasing the commodities, labor power, and means of production, which become productive capital, which become commodities of an increased value, which is then sold for money greater than the money capital invested. The total circuit of the first stage of capital has the first presupposition of its development, the quote, existence of a class of wage laborers on a social scale, end quote. Marx. Money capital, parenthesis, Geldkapital, and parenthesis, productive capital, Produktives Kapital, commodity capital, Warenkapital, are the three forms of the circuit, two stages of circulation on either end, and between them the intermediate stage of production. Quote, the form pertaining to the stage of production is that of productive capital, the capital which assumes these forms in the course of its total circuit, and then discards them, and in each of them performs the function corresponding to the particular form, is industrial capital. Bracket industrialis capital. And bracket. Industrial here in the sense that it comprises every branch of industry run on a capitalist basis, end quote. The other forms are not autonomous kinds of capital, but only successive particular forms of the functions of industrial capital. This, in fact, is capital's only mode of existence, in which the function of the appropriation of surplus value accompanies the process of its creation. It is true, therefore, that only with industrial capital is, quote, the capitalist character of production, ... a necessity, end quote. But as we have seen, quote, its existence implies the class antagonism, bracket, Klassengegensatz, in bracket, between capitalist and wage laborers, end quote. Indeed, if we return to the process of capital production, particularly capital production's earliest historical forms, the process of the production of relative surplus value, we immediately find the basic fact that, quote, capitalist production only then really begins, as we have already seen, when each individual capital employs simultaneously a comparatively large number of laborers, ... a greater number of laborers work together at the same time in one place, parenthesis, or, if you will, in the same field of labor, end parenthesis, in order to produce the same sort of commodity under the mastership of one capitalist, constitutes both historically and logically, bracket, historisch und begrifflich, and bracket, the starting point of capitalist production. And, quote, this point coincides with the birth of capital itself, end quote. Labor objectified in value is always labor at an average social quality, and thus always the explication of average labor power. And the concept of average social labor implies the historical realization of a total working day. Quote, thus the laws of the production of value are only fully realized for the individual producer when the individual producer produces as a capitalist and employs a number of workmen together whose labor, by that labor's collective nature, is at once stamped as average social labor, end quote. Marx. The specific productive power, bracket, Forza, and bracket, of the collective working day is greater than that of an equal number of single individual working days. That is the, quote, social productive power of labor, or the productive power of social labor, end quote. Marx. Quote, when the laborer cooperates systematically with others, the laborer strips off the fetters of the laborer's individuality and develops the capabilities of the laborer's species. Bracket, sein Gattungsvergnügen, end bracket, end quote. Marx. At the outset, the command of capital over labor presents itself only as a formal consequence of the fact that instead of working for herself, the worker works for the capitalist and thus under the capitalist. With the cooperation of many wage laborers, the command of capital evolves in accordance with the requirements of the execution of the labor process itself, which is to say, the real conditions of production. On the one hand, the functions of direction, oversight, bracket, Zorveglianza, end bracket, and coordination become functions of capital. On the other, the directive function, qua specific function of capital, takes on special characteristic notes. Quote, as the number of the cooperating laborers increases, so too does their resistance to the domination of capital, and with it the necessity for capital to overcome this resistance by counter-pressure. The control exercised by the capitalist is only a special function. Is not only a special function, due to the nature of the social labor process and peculiar to that process. But the control exercised by the capitalist is, at the same time, a function of the exploitation of a social labor process, and is consequently rooted in the unavoidable antagonism between the exploiter, bracket, Ausbeuter, end bracket, and the living and laboring raw material, bracket, Rohmaterial, end bracket. He exploits, end quote. Marx. So long as she negotiates with the capitalist, the worker does so as the proprietor of the worker's own labor power. The worker sells what the worker possesses, the worker's own individual singular power to work. The capitalist concludes the same contract with other isolated workers. The capitalist thus pays the value of each autonomous labor power, but does not pay for the workers' combined labor power. Thus, quote, being independent of each other, the laborers are isolated persons, bracket, Vereinselte, end bracket, who enter into relations with the capitalists, but not with one another. This cooperation begins only with the labor process. But the laborers have then ceased to belong to themselves. On entering that process, the laborers become incorporated with capital. As cooperators, as members of a working organism, they are but special modes of existence of capital. Hence the productive power developed by the laborer when working in cooperation, bracket, Arbeiter als gesellschaftlicher Arbeiter, or come operaio social, in bracket, or social, come operaio sociale, in bracket, I don't know, is the productive power of capital, end quote. Thus a considerable number of workers, which is to say the workers socially combined within one same production process under the same capitalist, becomes productive power for capital. The social productive power of labor does not exist outside of capital. This power is not elaborated by the worker before the worker's own labor belongs to the capitalist. It is an unpaid productive power. Marx says that it thus, quote, presents itself, end quote, parenthesis, usually erscheint, in parenthesis, as a productive power that capital naturally possesses, as its imminent productive power. And this is not just how things seem. As a producer, the worker does not have autonomy from the conditions of capitalist production. The worker would never have begun to produce if the worker had not first of all produced capital. In the passage from individual labor power to social labor power, from the worker to the social worker, labor transfers into capital, becomes a social productive power for capital. When labor power presents labor power's self-socialized in labor power's productive functions, there has already been a production of capital. The production of capital alone renders possible the process of the productive socialization of labor power, the birth of the social worker as a historical figure, as a social productive power of labor, a power incorporated in capital. This is another, perhaps the greatest of the examples of historical progress brought by capital. And yet, precisely within this, quote, progress, unquote, labor power, which at first presented itself as a presupposition of capital, independent of and counterposed to capital, is subordinated to capital, becomes, quote, part of capital, and is made an object of social exploitation. What does Marx mean then when Marx speaks of a, quote, class relation, unquote? Parenthesis, Klassenverhältnis, in parenthesis, already present in the moment in which capitalist and worker stand counterposed in the act of money capital purchasing labor power, in the formal act of exchange between money and labor power. When Marx speaks of the bracket constant and bracket, quote, existence of the class of wage laborers, bracket, Lohnarbeiterklasse, and bracket, unquote, as the first presupposition for the unfolding of the circuit of money capital. And when Marx says that the existence of industrial capital implies the existence of the, quote, class antagonism, bracket, Klassengegensatz, in bracket, between capitalists and wage laborers, end quote. Marx means precisely this. The historical figure in which the wage labor appears for the first time before the capitalist is the figure of the seller of labor power. Here at the same time is the first elementary form of antagonism between two classes, which already sees as counterposed the contracting parties in a necessary relationship between the possessors of opposed commodities. This is money purchasing labor power. But Marx tells us labor power being sold for money from the laborer's side. The wage laborer's decisive characteristics, as far as the market is concerned, are already present at this stage. That is, labor power purchased with money in the form of the wage. It is thanks to and through this form that this market transaction between money and labor power is recognized as characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. Yet the truth, the content of this form, is that within the contract for the purchase of labor power, what is in fact agreed is the provision for a quantity of labor greater than that necessary to compensate for the price of the labor power, and thus to cover the total wage. Therefore, a provision of surplus value is already presupposed and arranged by contract. This provision of surplus value is the fundamental condition for the capitalization of the value anticipated for the production of surplus value and thus of capital. It is true that when the worker takes on the auspices of an antagonistic figure, the worker first does so as the seller of labor power, but it is also true that the figure of the producer of surplus value is already presupposed within this antagonist. Is it this presupposition that makes the worker an antagonist at the class level on the labor market, or is the class antagonism already there in the worker being forced to become a wage laborer? That is, being forced to sell the only commodity that she possesses, her labor power. Marx says, quote, the capital relation during the process of production arises only, bracket, kommt nur heraus, end bracket, because the capital relation is inherent in the act of circulation, in the different fundamental economic conditions in which buyer and seller confront each other, in buyer and seller's class relation. It is not money which by money's nature creates this relation. It is rather the existence of this relation which permits of the transformation of a mere money function into a capital function. End quote. Marx. Thus, for Marx, there is no doubt that the class relation already exists in itself. Indeed, indeed, an sich, in parenthesis, in the act of circulation. It is precisely this aspect that reveals the capitalist relation, makes the capitalist relation come out during the production process. The class relation, parenthesis, Klassenverhältnis, in parenthesis, therefore proceeds, brings into being and produces the capitalist relation, parenthesis, Kapitalverhältnis, in parenthesis. Or better, it is the existence of the class relation that makes the transformation of money into capital possible. This is rather an important point. For in general, Marx is made to say exactly the opposite, and it is today commonly, quote, Marxist, end quote, to say the opposite. Namely, that the counterposition, the antagonism comes only from the capitalist production relation, and this antagonism is, then, only a new type compared to the old type, which has existed ever since human society was no longer a primitive community. Hence, it would be capital that made classes, or better, that transformed the old classes into new counterposed agglomerates that are still equivalent to what they were before. So how can we instead say that the class relation precedes the capitalist relation? In the act of the sale, we repeat an obligatory sale of labor power. We can see, and in what sense can we see? In the act of the sale, we repeat an obligatory sale of labor power. Can we see, and in what sense can we see, the already complete class relation of a social relation that allows the production of capital? Do wage laborers therefore first constitute themselves as a class precisely as sellers of labor power? We think yes, on one condition: that the concept of the working class is not fixed in a single and definitive form without development or history. With great strain, slowly, and, in truth, without much success, the Marxist camp has acquired the idea of an internal history of capital, such as would involve a specific analysis of the various determinations that capital assumes in the course of capital's development. This will, appropriately enough, lead to the goal of historical materialism with its overstretched Weltgeschichte. I think that's world history, I'm not sure. But what is still far from being assumed as a program of work, or indeed as a principle of our research method, is the idea of an internal history of the working class, such as would reconstruct the moments of the working class's formation, the changes in the working class's composition, the growth of the working class's organization, according to the various successive determinations that labor power assumes qua power producing capital, according to the diverse, recurrent, and ever new experiences of struggle that the working class mass chooses qua the only antagonist of capitalist society. The sale of labor power thus offers the first elementary stage of a composition of wage laborers into a class. A social mass obliged to sell labor power is also the general form of the working class. This is the case in Marx's sense. When Marx says that there is capital in money as soon as, at some point at least, money has already been transformed into capital, When Marx says that the circuit of money capital, the first stage in the total circulation of capital, is also the general form of the circuit of industrial capital, in which the capitalist mode of production is, however, presupposed. When he says that cooperation, the first elementary method of the production of relative surplus value, is also the fundamental form of capitalist production, even if its simple figure presents itself as a particular form alongside other more evolved forms which are, besides, already presupposed in this more simple figure. The sale of labor power presupposes the existence of labor power. Labor power's existence as a commodity and as a particular condition, three conditions which alone found the capitalist mode of production. And there's more. An act of sale of this nature is simultaneously both free and necessary. Free, because she who possesses the commodity is not juridically forced to sell the commodity. Necessary, because in effect she cannot not sell the commodity on pain of the extinction of her kind. We have seen that the sale of labor power already means the unpaid provision of surplus value, and thus the production of surplus value, and thus the reproduction of the capital relation. So the principal secret of capitalist production does not lie in the generic human capacity to work, but rather in the specific labor power of the wage laborer, as in its reduction to a wholly particular community, not therefore in labor power in itself, but in the exchange of labor power for money, which is to say, in the passage of the ownership of the only power that produces capital in the hands of those who already possess money. But then, the power that produces capital exists prior to and independently of the conditions of production that make it function as such, prior to and independently of money, qua possessor of means of labor and the material of labor. It is the encounter with money, its being put on an equal footing with the means and material of labor. In a word, the reduction of labor power itself to a condition of production that incorporates it into capital and makes it part of it as a living appendage of capital. On the working class side of things, the historic passage sees first a seller of labor power, then the individual productive power, then the social productive power. In the individual labor power, in its character as a particular commodity, the capacity to produce capital is already there. But only in capital, in its need to be a social production relation, is there the capacity to socialize labor power. Labor power has no possibility of autonomous socialization, independent of capital's needs. For this reason, once again, labor's social productive power presents itself as capital's productive power. It is precisely in the moment in which social labor power enters into production and transforms the collective laboring process into a social process of valorization, the very moment in which it essentially comes to coincide with a social mass of producers and thus touches on the natural confines of the, quote, working class, unquote, that it appears as nothing more than an internal part of capital, even in the antediluvian form of individual capital. The process through which labor power is socialized within capitalist production does not begin or conclude the process of the working class's historical formation. Rather, it is an essential intermediate moment of development in the organization of class antagonism, which can be used in practice depending on the relation of forces by either the capitalists or the workers. When the unpaid productive power of the social worker is added to the unpaid labor of the single worker, it advances a true and proper socialization of capitalist exploitation. This is now the exploitation not of the worker, but of the working class. This in turn is the true and proper birth certificate of a capitalist society, a leap in the history of capital which will, in the long term, lead it to overthrow the relations in its society and begin an inverse process of the socialization of capital up to its highest forms of social capital. And to speak of the exploitation not of the worker, but of the working class means that the working class already exists. The transition in the history of capital to the capitalist society implies the necessary existence of a class of capitalists. The process through which exploitation is socialized by way of capitalist production, which seems to mark the birth of the working class, in reality marks the birth of the opposed class, or the self-constitution of the opposed interest, that of the individual capitalist as a class. Only by incorporating the social productive power of labor into each individual capital was it possible to make each individual capitalist into a conscious member of a social class of capitalists. But the social productive power of labor, of the particular commodity labor power, was already, in its elementary and general form, the working class. Only by incorporating the working class into capital, only by making the working class part of capital, its living, mobile, variable part, was it possible to make the whole of capital, and not just the other dead, immobile, constant part, into a class counterposed to that of the workers. The process of the historical formation of a class of capitalists follows, copies, repeats the analogous process of the formation of the working class. Even to recognize this still raises scandal, and yet it is already banal. All the same, this is not everything, and it is not the fundamental thing. It is a methodological principle that ought to overturn the search for further perspective and instead guide the new strategy both from above and from afar. The fundamental thing is something else, for it comes even to imbue the everyday tactics of the class struggle, namely that from the outset, from the early forms of this struggle, the workers as a class find themselves within capital and must fight capital from within, whereas the class of capitalists is only counterposed to the workers and can strike it in block from without. This, which has been the working class's greatest point of weakness, should instead become the greatest sign of the working class's power. The workers enter the capitalist factory already as a class. Only thus can their social productive power be exploited. Constrained, not by juridical laws but by economic laws, to sell labor power, which is to say, to sell themselves on the market as a commodity, they find themselves already individually united against the capitalist, even before they begin to produce capital. On the other hand, the worker can function as an instrument of production only in association with other workers. The productive worker is a social labor power. Workers, like commodities, always appear in the plural. The single worker does not exist. We need only recall the historical concept from which capitalist production originated. A considerable number of workers, at the same time, in the same place, there for the production of the same kind of commodities, under the command of the same capitalist. Social labor power, the particular commodity labor power, begins to produce capital already as a working class. Labor's social productive power becomes a social productive power of capital. As a working class, workers enter into capital, are reduced to a part of capital as a working class. Capital now has capital's enemy within. This is how we prefer to interpret the meaning of Marx's opaque phrase that, quote, The true limit to capitalist production is capital itself, end quote. A need of production becomes a threat to the system. Capitalists respond by attempting, with great strain, to compose their single, disparate interest into the single social interest of an antagonist class. That's the end of chapter 2 of Mario Tronti's Marx, Labor Power, Working Class. Thank you so much for listening.